Modern scholars often begin their exploration of Goliath not in the valley of Elah, where his duel became legend, but on the shifting shorelines of the eastern Mediterranean. Here, beneath layers of sand and collapsed fortifications, lies the story of a vast migration that reshaped the ancient Near East. Long before Israel and Philistia clashed on the battlefield, winds carried ships carved in foreign styles toward the Levant. Vessels with curved prows, painted eyes, and construction techniques unknown in Canaan. These incoming groups, today identified collectively as the Sea Peoples, arrived in waves during a time of global upheaval when collapsing empires and climate stress destabilized old borders. Their presence marks the beginning of a new cultural landscape, one that produced the warrior remembered as Goliath. Archaeological excavations in Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath expose layers of destruction and rebuilding that align with the settlement of these newcomers. Beneath Philistine layers lie Canaanite ruins, yet above them appear halls adorned with Aegean-style pottery, hearth designs reminiscent of Mycenaean houses, and architectural choices foreign to the inland cultures of the Levant. These early Philistine sites show a fusion of local and imported traditions. Storage jars with spiral motifs traced back to the Aegean, loom weights shaped like those found in Cyprus, and cooking installations that did not appear in Israelite villages of the same period. This blending signals not only the arrival of migrants, but also their gradual adaptation as they transformed into a distinct people, the Philistines known from biblical and extra-biblical texts. Texts from Egypt provide clues to the turmoil that set these migrations in motion. Reliefs from the reign of Ramesses III depict battles against foreign peoples with feathered headdresses, round shields, and swords that do not match Egyptian or Levantine styles. These images show combatants in families, not merely soldiers. Ox carts carrying women and children, suggesting permanent relocation rather than temporary raiding. Scholars see these depictions as a rare snapshot of the very groups that would later establish the Pentapolis of Philistine cities. Though Egyptian accounts are propagandistic, they preserve details of dress and weaponry that correspond closely with artifacts uncovered in Philistine layers centuries later. As these groups settled along the coastal plain, they reshaped the political geography of the region. The land that would become Philistia lay at the crossroads of trade connecting Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, and the wider Aegean. By controlling this corridor, the newcomers rapidly grew in economic strength. Their access to coastal trade routes allowed them to absorb ideas, materials, and techniques from multiple cultures. This dynamic exchange accelerated their adoption of iron technology, which they mastered earlier than many neighboring peoples. While Israelite villages still relied primarily on bronze tools, the Philistines forged iron weapons and harnessed advanced smelting methods, giving their warriors a material advantage on the battlefield. Gath, believed by many scholars to be Goliath's hometown, appears in archaeological surveys as one of the largest and most formidable cities in the region during the early Iron Age. Its walls and ramparts reveal a settlement expanding beyond typical Canaanite scale, while grain silos and industrial areas point to a thriving urban economy. Excavated streets yield heavy weapons, distinctive helmets, and large defensive towers, evidence of a culture that placed high value on martial readiness. In such an environment, Elite warriors were not merely fighters, but symbols of civic pride, representing a fusion of cultural identity and military strength. The origins of unusually large warriors in Philistine tradition may stem from a combination of environmental, cultural, and genetic factors. Ancient societies often elevated physically imposing individuals into elite ranks, reinforcing social hierarchies through visual intimidation. In the Aegean world, earlier epics celebrated heroes described with enormous size and strength, and echoes of this tradition appear in Philistine culture. This does not require belief in mythical giants. Rather, it reflects an anthropological pattern in which military elites were selectively trained, well-fed, and equipped, resulting in greater height and muscle development than surrounding populations. Skeletal finds in some Mediterranean warrior burials reveal individuals significantly taller than their contemporaries, supporting the plausibility of such figures in Iron Age Philistia. At the same time, biblical texts offer a distinct cultural memory of encountering warriors of exceptional size. Stories of formidable opponents appear not only in the account of David's duel, but also in other narratives involving neighboring peoples. Later traditions, including early Jewish interpretations and writings preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discuss groups remembered for their unusual stature. While these texts blend history and memory, they provide insight into how ancient Israel perceived its most fearsome adversaries, not merely as military threats, but as daunting embodiments of cultural difference. In this context, Goliath emerges as a product of his world rather than an anomaly. His described height, whether read through the lens of the Hebrew tradition that portrays him as towering above ordinary men, or the alternative textual tradition that presents him as large, but not impossibly so, becomes more comprehensible against the backdrop of a society that prized physical dominance. Both versions align with known patterns of variation in ancient manuscripts, where numerical descriptions often shift due to differences in measuring systems. Whether his stature approached the exceptional or the unbelievable, he represented the pinnacle of Philistine martial development. Understanding Goliath's people requires acknowledging their rapid cultural transformation. Within generations, the Philistines evolved from displaced migrants into a powerful force whose identity blended Aegean roots with Levantine adaptation. Their foodways, religious practices, and military strategies bore marks of both origin and environment. Temples dedicated to their deities incorporated architectural motifs foreign to Canaan, yet their pottery increasingly adapted to local tastes. Their weapons showed Aegean lineage, but were modified for warfare in the rugged valleys and plains of Canaan. This hybrid identity shaped the world in which Goliath was trained, armed, and celebrated. Yet the story of his people is not merely about conflict. Their prosperity fostered a vibrant urban life. Trade networks radiated from their ports, artisans produced distinctive goods, and scribes borrowed scripts and languages from surrounding cultures. This cosmopolitan environment stood in stark contrast to the rural highland villages from which Israelite leaders emerged. The differences were not only military, but social, economic, and ideological. When these two worlds collided, the confrontation between David and Goliath became a symbolic expression of the broader tensions shaping the region. As tensions escalated, the Valley of Elah became a natural arena for confrontation. Its geography, a fertile corridor bordered by ridges, allowed armies to face one another with clear sight lines while maintaining access to supply routes. Philistine incursions into this valley threatened Judah's agricultural base and its ability to defend the approach to the highlands. Israel's response required not only military resistance, but psychological resilience. In the face of Philistine professional armies, the appearance of a champion like Goliath was a strategic weapon designed to intimidate and demoralize. The origins of Goliath and his people thus form the foundation for understanding the legendary duel. The story is not isolated. It emerges from migrations, cultural exchanges, technological disparities, and competing political visions. Long before David stepped into the valley, forces stretching across continents shaped the life of the warrior who awaited him. And long before the stone struck its mark, the region's history had already carved the lines of their confrontation. To understand why the Philistines dominated the early Iron Age battlefield, scholars turn to the physical evidence left behind in their workshops, armories, and industrial zones. Across the coastal plain, excavations reveal that they mastered iron production and distribution earlier and more efficiently than surrounding cultures. While Israelite settlements show mostly agrarian tools and simple bronze implements, Philistine centers exhibit slag heaps, forging pits, and metal remains that point to systematic weapon manufacturing. This disparity is not a minor footnote of history. It shaped the psychology of warfare in the region. When Philistine armies marched, their armor gleamed with materials rare in the highlands, and their swords bore the weight and balance of a more advanced metallurgical tradition. Material advantages translated into tactical confidence. Contemporary accounts from neighboring societies describe the Philistines as aggressive in open field engagements, favoring infantry formations reinforced by elite champions. Their knowledge of coastal combat strategies, honed from generations of maritime travel and conflict, translated well into the broad plains and lowland valleys bordering Judah. The Israelites, by contrast, came from a tribal confederation still building centralized authority. Their militia forces lacked uniform equipment, and even with the rise of kingship, their supply lines could not match the industrial output of Philistine cities. This imbalance explains much of the dread recorded in ancient narratives. Israel did not simply fear a single warrior, but the military machine standing behind him. One of the most revealing archaeological indicators of Philistine military superiority lies in their helmet design. Distinctive feathered or crested helmets appear both in Egyptian reliefs and in debris recovered from Philistine destruction layers. These helmets often incorporated bronze reinforcement and articulated cheek guards, offering protection far beyond the simple leather caps used by many early Israelite fighters. Combined with large circular shields and breastplates modeled on Aegean prototypes, Philistine champions presented an imposing figure on the battlefield, one intended to convey dominance before a single blow was struck. When textual traditions describe an opponent whose appearance filled seasoned soldiers with fear, they are reflecting a very real visual strategy. Weaponry also played a crucial role in cementing Philistine reputation. Broad-bladed swords, longer than typical Canaanite forms, were well suited for both slashing and thrusting. The craftsmanship visible in iron spearheads and javelins suggests skilled smiths capable of producing uniform weapons in large quantities. At certain sites, Industrial zones contained leftover molds for casting metal fittings, indicating an almost assembly line approach uncommon in the broader region. These advantages were magnified by Philistine familiarity with Mediterranean combat styles, emphasizing discipline, formation control, and champion-led intimidation. The duel-based challenge issued at the Valley of Elah is consistent with this cultural mentality. The idea that a single warrior could embody the strength of an entire army. Philistine culture was not solely defined by warfare. Their daily life reveals a society with distinct tastes, customs, and artistic expressions. Pottery from this era, known as Philistine Bikram ware, displays bold patterns in red and black inspired by Aegean styles, but adapted to Levantine forms. Decorative motifs, birds, spirals, geometric arrangements, reflect a cultural memory of faraway lands even as they evolve to suit a new environment. These vessels appear not only in elite homes, but throughout urban neighborhoods, suggesting that the Philistine identity permeated all levels of society. Such widespread uniformity implies a cohesive cultural framework, strengthened further by shared religious practices centered around temples that blended foreign and local architectural elements. Excavated temple complexes in Philistine cities reveal altars and cultic objects that differ from those in both Israelite and Canaanite contexts. Certain shrines incorporate large stone pillars and hearths reminiscent of Aegean ritual spaces. At some sites, researchers uncovered evidence of offerings that match patterns found in Cyprus and Crete. Animal bones arranged in specific configurations, ceremonial drinking vessels, and figurines with stylistic features foreign to inland traditions. These religious practices provided a sense of communal identity that bound the Philistines together in ways that went beyond mere political alliances. When a champion like Goliath stepped forward, he carried the spiritual weight of his people, representing not only their army, but their gods and heritage. Daily life in Philistine cities also reveals contrasts with the simpler rural lifestyle of early Israel. Archaeological findings show evidence of advanced food storage systems, imported goods, and thriving artisan industries. Large pithoi used for grain and oil suggest coordinated economic planning, while workshops for textile production and metallurgy point to a diverse urban economy. In contrast, Israelite villages of the same era often lacked specialized industries and relied heavily on household-based production. These differences shaped how each society approached conflict. Philistines projected uniform power from centralized urban hubs, while Israelites defended decentralized settlements scattered across hill country. The contrast extended into agricultural practices. The fertile plains under Philistine control allowed for extensive cultivation of grains and legumes, while access to coastal trade supplemented their diet with fish and imported delicacies. Analysis of botanical remains indicates the presence of species uncommon in highland regions, further illustrating the diversity of their diet. Such abundance contributed to better overall nutrition, which in turn played a role in producing stronger, taller individuals within certain segments of the population. While height differences between populations are influenced by many factors, consistent access to calories and protein is a significant one. Thus, the towering warriors remembered in ancient texts may reflect genuine biological outcomes shaped by economic stability. Social stratification in Philistine society also played a role in producing elite Fighters, warriors recruited from noble or wealthy families, likely enjoyed superior diets, training, and equipment. They grew up in environments where physical prowess was cultivated from youth. Some burials discovered in Philistine regions contain individuals interred with weapons, armor fragments, or luxury goods, indicating a class of elite, martial families. These graves often include taller than average skeletons, supporting the idea that physical stature was valued and perhaps even selectively fostered. Though no remains can be tied directly to Goliath himself, the pattern demonstrates that his exceptional size, whether legendary or historical, fits a broader trend in the culture. Urbanization further strengthened Philistine cohesion. Their cities were designed with broad streets, administrative areas, and fortifications that suggest sophisticated planning. At Gath, massive city walls and defensive ramparts indicate a settlement prepared not just for trade, but for sustained conflict. Excavations show evidence of rapid expansion during periods when Philistine political influence peaked. This urban intensity contrasts with the smaller, more fragmented Israelite villages, which lacked the infrastructure to support large-scale military operations. Israel's reliance on personal courage and tactical ingenuity, exemplified by the figure of David, becomes more understandable when viewed against the backdrop of Philistine structural advantage. Despite their strength, the Philistines were not monolithic. Their culture evolved rapidly as they interacted with the inhabitants of Canaan. Over generations, their pottery styles shifted, their diet diversified, and their language began absorbing local elements. They maintained connections to their Aegean roots, but they were no longer foreigners. They had become a distinct people shaped by the Levantine environment. This hybrid identity explains the unique blend of features seen in their archaeological and textual footprint. It also contextualizes how their champions came to embody a fusion of Mediterranean physicality and Near Eastern warfare. As the Philistines expanded their influence, tensions with Israel escalated. Their attempts to control rural valleys threatened Israelite agriculture and trade. Skirmishes, raids, and territorial disputes became common, creating an atmosphere ripe for open confrontation. When the Philistines advanced into the valley of Elah, they did so not as opportunistic raiders, but as a disciplined force, asserting strategic dominance. Their appearance there was a calculated move to intimidate and destabilize Israel's fragile political unity. The presence of a champion like Goliath was not merely tradition. It was a demonstration of supremacy intended to break the morale of the opposing army before a single clash of shields. Yet, beneath their military power lay vulnerabilities. Their cultural integration with the surrounding region made them susceptible to political shifts, while reliance on urban centers created structural weaknesses in extended campaigns. These complexities shaped the landscape into which David would later step. The duel that took place in the valley cannot be separated from the broader context of Philistine might and Israelite adaptation. It was a moment born from centuries of migration, technological change, cultural blending, and geopolitical maneuvering. The stage was set, a confident, iron-equipped warrior aristocracy facing a people whose strength lay not in uniform weaponry, but in resilience, innovation, and faith. And within this tension, a single confrontation would soon unfold, capturing the imagination of generations and reshaping the story of Near Eastern history. To understand the rise of Philistine warrior elites, historians examine the social structures that nurtured them and the psychological environment that elevated certain individuals into symbols of national strength. In cities like Ashkelon and Gath, youth training likely began early. Artistic fragments from the wider Aegean world, the cultural background from which the Philistines emerged, suggest that athleticism, combat preparation, and public displays of strength were ingrained traditions. While direct Philistine training manuals do not survive, parallels drawn from their ancestral regions reveal societies that valued physical competition and warrior prestige. This cultural inheritance shaped an environment where height and strength were cultivated, admired, and woven into identity. Archaeological evidence reinforces the idea that Philistine leaders invested heavily in the development of elite fighters. Excavations of open courtyards and large communal areas in their cities point to spaces that could have been used for training and public ceremony. Similar spaces in Aegean sites served as arenas for demonstrations of physical skill, ritual tests of courage, and communal gatherings where champions were celebrated. When combined with fortified military installations and extensive weapon workshops, these features paint a portrait of a culture where martial excellence was not simply a function of necessity, but a core societal value. In such a society, an unusually tall and powerful youth would have been singled out early, nurtured in an environment that expected him to become both protector and emblem. The physical characteristics of Philistine warriors also align with the broader Mediterranean pattern of elite height variation. Studies of skeletal remains in regions connected to the Sea Peoples show individuals who stood noticeably taller than average populations in the Levant. This was likely influenced by superior access to protein-rich diets, especially fish and coastal resources, as well as deliberate breeding patterns within warrior families. When ancient narratives speak of imposing figures who towered above their peers, they reflect historical memories rooted in genuine biological and social phenomena. Goliath's remarkable size becomes less extraordinary and more emblematic of a specific cultural tradition. The role of intimidation in Philistine warfare cannot be overstated. Their champions embodied psychological strategy. In a world where armor, weapons, and physical stature carried symbolic power, the presence of an enormous warrior could unsettle opposing troops before the battle began. Literary motifs from the ancient Near East frequently emphasize the terror induced by formidable opponents, and these motifs align closely with the tactics attributed to the Philistines. Their use of single combat challenges served not only to limit bloodshed, but to assert dominance, projecting superiority through the body of a single fighter. Whether in ritual contexts or battlefield scenarios, a giant-like warrior was the ultimate intimidation tool. Weaponry amplified this effect. Philistine champions often carried gear that reflected their Aegean heritage. Long, heavy swords with leaf-shaped blades provided reach and cutting power. Spearheads forged with precision and consistency gave their frontline fighters reliable weaponry uncommon in rural Israelite communities. Armor plates, likely crafted from bronze and supplemented with iron components, gave these warriors defensive advantages in close engagement. Even their boots and greaves, less frequently preserved in the archaeological record but depicted in artistic representations, contributed to an imposing silhouette. Combined with great height, such equipment created an overwhelming visual presence. Ancient narratives also reveal that the Philistines valued the idea of a champion as a representative of divine backing. Their deities, absorbed from both local and foreign traditions, were often depicted as powerful figures associated with strength, storms, or warfare. Temples dedicated to their gods contained ceremonial objects that may have been connected to military rituals, reinforcing the belief that elite warriors acted as earthly extensions of divine will. When Goliath stepped into the valley of Elah, he likely did so as more than a soldier. He was a spiritual representative of a people whose gods were seen as guardians of their martial supremacy. Understanding how the Israelites viewed such champions requires examining their own cultural context. Israelite settlements of the early Iron Age reveal a society structured around kinship, rural labor, and decentralized forms of leadership. Their tools, homes, and defensive structures show practicality rather than grandeur. While they possessed capable fighters, their traditions emphasized cunning, faith, and resilience over towering strength or physical intimidation. The Israelite worldview interpreted enemies like the Philistines not only through military lens, but through moral and theological categories. The imposing stature of Philistine champions therefore took on layered meaning. These warriors represented both military threat and cultural challenge. The contrast between the two societies helps explain why narratives about unusually tall opponents resonate so deeply. For the Israelites, encountering warriors of remarkable size affirmed their sense of vulnerability and dependency on divine aid. For the Philistines, elevating such figures reinforced their dominance and cultural identity. These mirrored perceptions created fertile ground for the memories that would later become preserved in texts. The psychological reality of facing a physically overwhelming foe became intertwined with deeper cultural narratives about identity, conflict, and destiny. Archaeological perspectives also shed light on this tension. The Philistine Pentapolis, the 5 major cities, was interconnected through shared political, economic, and military alliances. Their combined population, industrial output, and military resources overwhelmed the scattered Israelite villages to the east. Yet, while the Philistines represented strength, the Israelites represented adaptability. Their familiarity with rugged terrain, their tradition of guerrilla tactics, and their reliance on unconventional weapons such as slings allowed them to compensate for weaknesses in direct combat. In this interplay between strength and strategy, the duel between David and Goliath becomes a symbolic expression of deeper cultural dynamics. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Philistine military tradition is their adoption and adaptation of foreign styles. Their armor, weapons, and battle tactics reveal a culture that actively integrated influences from Cyprus, the Aegean, Egypt, and Canaan. This flexibility made them formidable opponents, capable of outmaneuvering neighboring powers. It also suggests that individuals like Goliath may have received training shaped by multiple martial traditions. Rather than being a simple warrior, he may have been versed in combat styles that fused Mediterranean and Levantine techniques, a hybrid skill set rare among Iron Age fighters. Social expectations intensified the pressure placed upon Philistine champions. Their cities celebrated martial achievements with public honor and ritual recognition. Elite warriors likely participated in ceremonies that connected them symbolically to their ancestors and deities. In societies where physical might served as both political and religious capital, a champion bore the burden of representing the collective strength of his people. Success elevated him to near mythic status. Failure risked undermining the morale of the entire army. This cultural weight helps explain why Goliath's challenge in the Valley of Elah was so bold and so theatrical. He was not merely seeking a duel. He was performing the role that society had shaped for him. The warrior class played additional roles beyond battle. They often served as envoys, negotiators, and protectors of high-status families. Their presence at communal events reinforced social hierarchies and transmitted cultural values to younger generations. Through these roles, the image of the physically imposing warrior became deeply embedded in Philistine identity. Tales of their strength circulated orally long before they entered written narratives. Even enemy societies adopted these memories, incorporating them into their own sacred and historical texts. Thus, the memory of a giant champion is as much an anthropological phenomenon as it is a literary one. In this environment, a figure like Goliath was not an anomaly, but the natural product of a culture that valued strength, celebrated height, and crafted warriors through a mix of heritage, environment, and training. His size, armor, and theatrical presence were not exaggerations invented by storytelling, but reflections of real social and military conditions. The cultural stage that produced him was shaped by centuries of migration, adaptation, and competition. And when he stepped into the valley facing Israel, he did so as the culmination of this long process, the ultimate emblem of Philistine confidence. Yet beneath this power lay the tension of an evolving world. New political forces were rising in the region. Israel, though less equipped, was gaining unity and purpose. Their leaders understood the symbolic importance of confronting Philistine dominance, and their young fighters, shaped not by urban militarization, but by rugged landscapes and personal resourcefulness, brought a different kind of strength to the battlefield. The collision of these two systems, the disciplined, iron-equipped Philistine order and the flexible Highland Israelite resilience, would soon produce one of the most pivotal moments in ancient Near Eastern memory. Debates over Goliath's actual height begin long before modern scholars enter the conversation. The question arises from the ancient manuscripts themselves, which do not all preserve the same measurement. Some traditions describe him as towering beyond the limits of ordinary human stature, while others present a height still formidable, but more consistent with elite warriors of the Iron Age. Understanding these differences requires stepping into the world of ancient measurement systems, a world where cubits varied by region, scribal transmission shaped textual details, and the meaning of physical descriptions often carried symbolic weight as well as historical memory. The oldest surviving Hebrew manuscripts, preserved in the Masoretic tradition, describe a height that translates into proportions rarely encountered in ancient populations. Yet earlier textual witnesses, including Greek translations and manuscripts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, record a shorter height, one still imposing but within anthropologically documented ranges. This variation has sparked rigorous academic debate. Scholars of ancient languages analyze the wording, tracing how scribes in different eras handled numerical phrases. In ancient Hebrew, numbers involving measurements were among the most susceptible to alteration. A single stroke of a pen could transform one unit into another. Differences between royal cubits, common cubits, and regional measures further complicated matters. Thus, the question of Goliath's size cannot be answered by a single manuscript. It must be approached by reconstructing the world that produced these texts. To grasp how measurement worked in Iron Age societies, archaeologists examine physical artifacts such as building stones, architectural outlines, weapons, and everyday objects. These provide clues about the practical lengths associated with various cubit systems. In regions influenced by Egypt, the royal cubit was longer and more standardized. In other areas, local measures differed by several centimeters. When ancient scribes recorded a warrior's height using these systems, they assumed cultural familiarity. Modern readers, however, inherit the number without the context. The debate is therefore not merely about height, but about cultural translation, the complex act of moving ancient ideas into modern understanding. Scholars also consider how ancient Near Eastern literature used physical description symbolically. In many cultures of the region, exceptional height signified divine favor, unique strength, or extraordinary lineage. Stories involving imposing figures were not always concerned with precise measurement, but with communicating awe. Yet Israelite texts differ from surrounding epics in that they often blend symbolic language with historical memory. Their narratives preserve real geographical details, political events, and cultural references, while also conveying theological significance. When they describe an enemy champion as extraordinarily tall, they may be recording both a physical reality and a dramatic impression. In this sense, the memory of Goliath's height becomes a convergence of fact, perception, and cultural meaning. Anthropological research supports the idea that certain groups in the Aegean and Mediterranean regions produced individuals who were noticeably taller than populations in the Levant. Skeletal remains from areas associated with the broader sea peoples show height patterns exceeding local averages by significant margins. These findings align with environmental factors: diets rich in fish protein, large-scale availability of grain, and access to meat from animal herding. Combined with genetic diversity introduced through maritime mobility, these conditions created biological variation that made elite tall warriors entirely plausible. When ancient texts describe imposing champions from these groups, they may be reflecting genuine demographic distinctions. Comparing ancient descriptions of formidable warriors across cultures also sheds light on Goliath's portrayal. Egyptian reliefs depict foreign fighters with exaggerated proportions, emphasizing their threat. Mesopotamian inscriptions refer to enemies in terms that highlight fearsome physical attributes. These stylizations served political purposes, reinforcing the courage of the home army and the might of the king. Yet beneath the exaggeration often lay real differences, accentuated by artistic convention. The Israelite description of Goliath, however, stands out for its procedural detail. References to specific weapons, armor components, and weights. These details resemble inventory-style documentation more than mythic hyperbole. They suggest that the narrative drew from remembered features of Philistine military equipment, not from imagined fantasy. The armor attributed to Goliath provides another angle for evaluating height. Heavy bronze or iron components, a coat of scaled plates, a massive spear shaft, a helmet with reinforced cheek guards, would require significant strength to wield effectively. Archaeologists have uncovered armor fragments and weaponry from the era that match the types described, confirming their historical plausibility. The weight and dimensions of such equipment indicate that the warriors who bore them needed not only skill, but exceptional physical capacity. Even without relying on exaggerated measurements, the equipment itself implies a man of remarkable stature and endurance. Some scholars propose that the differing height traditions in ancient manuscripts reflect an evolution in how Israel remembered the confrontation. As generations retold the story, community memory may have emphasized Goliath's terrifying presence more than the numerical precision of his height. Other researchers argue the opposite, that earlier manuscripts preserved the more modest measurement, and later scribes expanded it to heighten the dramatic contrast. Both theories rely on known patterns of textual development. Numerical inflation sometimes occurred in ancient literature, particularly when retelling heroic accounts. Yet numerical simplification also occurred when scribes reproduced texts in contexts where original measures were poorly understood. The truth may lie in a complex interplay of these tendencies. Regardless of which measurement reflects the earliest tradition, both paint a consistent picture. Goliath was remembered as a warrior who dwarfed the average soldier of his time, embodying the martial pride of a powerful society. His height, whether extraordinary or colossal, functioned not as mythology, but as a narrative expression of Philistine dominance. His physical presence represented the challenge Israel faced, not only militarily, but psychologically. The duel in the valley would not have resonated across centuries if the Philistine champion had been merely adequate. His exceptional stature anchored the message of the narrative. Israel confronted an opponent who embodied overwhelming strength, and the unexpected victory that followed reshaped their collective memory. The Valley of Elah, where this confrontation unfolded, also plays into the understanding of Goliath's height and presence. The geography of the valley amplifies sound and visibility. A warrior standing in its central plain, clad in shimmering armor, would appear even more imposing to soldiers lined along the opposing slopes. The natural acoustics would carry his voice across the field, magnifying his challenge. Ancient armies understood the psychological impact of such settings. Choosing a champion to issue a public challenge in this environment was a tactical decision. The Philistines were leveraging not only physical might, but environmental theater, transforming the valley into a stage for intimidation. To reconstruct these dynamics, archaeologists examined the topography, analyzing line-of-sight patterns and estimating how ancient armies would have positioned themselves. The valley remains remarkably unchanged, allowing researchers to visualize how a towering warrior in heavy armor might have dominated the battlefield. The slopes on either side rise gently, providing clear vantage points. A champion standing at the center would be visible from great distances. This natural amphitheater magnified the fearsome reputation of Philistine champions and ensured that Goliath's height, whatever its exact measurement, would leave a lasting impression. In this context, the variations preserved in textual traditions become less about mathematical precision and more about the collective memory of a culture confronted by a formidable enemy. Goliath's height reflects an intersection of physical reality, narrative function, and cultural perception. Whether described in the terms of one manuscript or another, the memory remains consistent. He was a warrior whose size symbolized the power of his people, whose presence embodied the confidence of a militarized urban society, and whose defeat would become a defining moment in the shaping of Israel's identity. Thus, the debate over his height is not an obstacle to understanding. It is a gateway. It leads modern readers deeper into the complexities of ancient textual transmission, archaeological interpretation, and cultural psychology. It reveals a world where measurement served multiple purposes: practical, symbolic, and narrative. And it prepares the foundation for the moment when a young shepherd stepped into the valley to confront the champion whose very stature had been crafted to break the resolve of nations. The valley of Elah stands today as a quiet stretch of farmland framed by low ridges and scattered with olive trees. Yet its serene appearance hides a history of strategic importance that shaped the fate of kingdoms. For centuries, this corridor served as a gateway between the Philistine-controlled coastal plain and the highlands of Judah. Whoever commanded this valley controlled access to trade routes, agricultural resources, and defensive positions critical to the stability of both societies. To reconstruct why the Philistines marched here with confidence, and why Israel feared the incursion, scholars combine archaeology, topography, and environmental studies, each adding a dimension to the battlefield that framed the duel remembered across millennia. Surveys of the valley reveal traces of ancient farming installations, terraces, wine presses carved into the bedrock, and remnants of defensive watchtowers. These features indicate that the region was not merely a battleground, but a lifeline for the rural economy of Judah. Philistine control of the valley would have disrupted food production and taxation systems, weakening Israel's emerging political structure. Conversely, Israelite resistance in this region represented an attempt to preserve autonomy and prevent Philistine expansion into the heartland. The valley was therefore not chosen at random. It was the natural front line of a geopolitical struggle. Archaeologists have identified Iron Age sites on the surrounding hills that provide insight into the military landscape of the time. One of the most notable discoveries is a fortified site near the northern ridge that some scholars associate with early Judahite defense systems. The site contains double walls, casemate architecture, and ceramics consistent with Israelite settlements of the era. Its location suggests it may have been part of a network of fortifications intended to slow or monitor Philistine advances. Whether or not this site directly relates to the confrontation described in ancient texts, its existence confirms that the region was militarized and contested. The valley's shape plays a critical role in understanding how armies assembled and confronted each other. Its broad, open floor allows for the formation of battle lines, while the rising ridges offer clear vantage points. When two armies established camps on opposite slopes, as ancient narratives describe, they positioned themselves in alignment with natural defensive advantages. Each side could observe movements below while maintaining secure footing. A champion descending into the valley would be visible to the full assembly, turning the confrontation into a public spectacle. The geography thus facilitated the dramatic, ritualized challenge issued by the Philistine warrior. Atmospheric conditions also influenced the psychological impact of such a confrontation. The valley acts as a natural amplifier of sound. A deep voice calling out from its center would resonate across the ridges. Scholars examining the acoustics note that even ordinary speech carries remarkably well across the terrain, and a trained warrior projecting his voice would be heard with startling clarity. This dynamic helps explain the terror described in ancient accounts. The Philistines understood the value of psychological warfare. By placing their champion in the center of this natural amphitheater, they used the environment itself as a weapon. The strategic significance of the Valley of Elah extends beyond its role in this famous confrontation. Historical records show repeated conflicts in the surrounding region during the Iron Age, often involving control of the same trade routes. Philistine armies moved inland not only for territorial gain, but to secure access to the highlands, whose agricultural surplus supported growing populations. Israel's leaders recognized the threat and attempted to fortify their borders. Yet, despite these efforts, the Philistines frequently gained the upper hand due to their superior equipment, organization, and urban infrastructure. The duel remembered today represents only one moment in a much larger and ongoing struggle. Excavations in Philistine heartlands show that their cities were densely populated, fortified, and economically vibrant. These conditions allowed them to project power beyond their borders. When they advanced into the valley, they did so with confidence in their logistical and military strength. Their leaders likely viewed the encounter not as a gamble, but as a demonstration of dominance. The challenge issued by their champion was a calculated part of their strategy, an opportunity to demoralize Israel's army and assert superiority without engaging in a costly, full-scale battle. Israel, meanwhile, struggled with internal limitations. Their settlements lacked the industrial centers necessary to produce large quantities of standardized weapons. Their armies relied heavily on local militias, shepherds, and farmers who took up arms when summoned. Although Israel possessed strong traditions of courage and independence, they lacked the centralized training and equipment that characterized Philistine forces. This disparity is reflected in the hesitation described in ancient texts. When confronted with a towering, heavily armored champion in the valley's open plain, Israel's troops faced a psychological barrier as imposing as the physical threat before them. To reconstruct the likely appearance of the battlefield, scholars consider environmental reconstructions. Pollen analysis and botanical studies indicate that the valley would have been greener in the early Iron Age, with fields of grain stretching across its floor. The seasonality of harvest may have influenced when armies chose to march. For example, advancing into the valley after the harvest would allow the invading army to seize stores of grain or use the cleared fields as ideal terrain for battle formation. Such considerations reveal that the confrontation remembered in ancient literature was part of a strategic calculus shaped by environmental rhythms. Weaponry found in the region also provides insight into the combat potential of each side. Philistine spearheads, javelins, and swords discovered in their cities show advanced metalwork and uniform casting. Israelite sites, by comparison, often yield simpler bronze implements or locally forged iron pieces, lacking the consistency seen in Philistine armories. The technological advantage of the Philistines would have been evident to anyone facing them across the valley. A champion armed with state-of-the-art weaponry, clad in armor crafted by skilled smiths, represented the pinnacle of this advantage. His presence was not only physical, but symbolic. He embodied the entire military-industrial strength of his people. The valley's geography also reveals tactical vulnerabilities. While its open floor offered space for champions to issue challenges, its slopes made it difficult for lightly equipped fighters to advance against heavily armored opponents. The Philistines, with their emphasis on infantry dominance, benefited from terrain that favored direct confrontation. Israel, whose fighters excelled in mobile, ranged tactics, found themselves at a disadvantage in the valley's central plain. This mismatch set the stage for a duel rather than traditional battle. Under these conditions, a single confrontation could determine the outcome of the entire encounter. The cultural significance of the valley becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of later historical memory. For Israel, this site became a place where an overwhelming threat was overcome. For the Philistines, it was a stage for demonstrating their supremacy until the unexpected occurred. The dramatic tension of the valley, shaped by its geography, climate, and strategic importance, magnified the meaning of the confrontation. What might have been a routine military maneuver became the setting for one of the most influential narratives in ancient Near Eastern history. The Valley of Elah thus serves as more than a backdrop. It is an active participant in the story, influencing decisions, amplifying voices, and shaping perceptions. It clarifies why the Philistines chose this location, why Israel hesitated, and why the duel that took place here resonated so deeply. As the narrative moves toward the encounter between the shepherd and the champion, the valley remains constant, a silent witness to a clash between two very different ways of life. When the Philistines advanced into the valley of Elah, they confronted an Israel whose military weaknesses were not merely tactical, but structural. Israel was transitioning from a loose tribal network into an early monarchy, a shift that left gaps in its defensive capabilities. Rural communities scattered across the highlands relied on kinship ties for protection, and their local leaders lacked the centralized authority required to form a consistent standing army. Archaeology confirms this portrait. The early hill country settlements show modest homes, small storage pits, and limited evidence of specialized industry. These features reflect a society built around subsistence farming rather than organized warfare. The contrast with Philistine urban centers was stark. The Philistines possessed fortified cities, industrial workshops, and administrative systems capable of sustaining and equipping professional soldiers. They had the infrastructure to store grain, produce surplus goods, and distribute weapons. Their armies marched with logistical support that Israel could not match. Israel's fighters, by contrast, were often farmers summoned from their fields, armed with whatever tools or simple weapons they had available. This imbalance created a psychological divide as much as a material one. When Israelite soldiers faced a heavily armored champion, they stood not only before an individual, but before an entire system of military and economic power. Even the basic structure of Israel's weapons reveals their limitations. Excavations from Iron Age Israelite sites frequently uncover sickle blades, pruning hooks, and small bronze knives, tools that doubled as makeshift weapons in times of conflict. Slings were common, but they were primarily the weapons of shepherds and hunters rather than formal infantry. Bows existed but were not standardized or mass-produced. Israel lacked the smithing infrastructure necessary to produce uniform spearheads or swords. By contrast, Philistine cities contained industrial-scale metalworking districts, complete with casting molds, slag piles, and production floors. This contrast meant that Philistine warriors marched into battle with reliable, well-crafted weapons, while many Israelite fighters carried tools repurposed for war. Armor further illustrates the disparity. The Philistine champion described in ancient narratives wears a coat of scaled armor, a technology that required skilled smiths and significant material resources. Examples of similar armor from the era reveal tightly arranged metal plates sewn onto leather or linen backings. Producing such armor demanded both expertise and economic surplus. Israelite rural settlements, lacking metal workshops and large stores of materials, could not outfit soldiers in comparable gear. Most Israelite fighters entered battle with little more than cloaks, simple tunics, and perhaps small shields. Their primary defense was mobility, terrain knowledge, and improvisation. The psychological effect of facing a well-equipped opponent cannot be overstated. Ancient armies relied heavily on morale. A single demoralizing display could determine the outcome of a conflict before combat began. Philistine forces understood this reality and exploited it by placing their champion at the forefront. The warrior's armor gleamed, his weapons were superior, and his stature made him the embodiment of Philistine dominance. Israel's soldiers, witnessing this figure step into the valley, confronted not only the physical threat, but their own insecurities. Archaeology, textual narratives, and anthropological insights converge on this point. Israel entered the field at a profound disadvantage, both materially and psychologically. Leadership structures also played a role in Israel's military vulnerability. The monarchy was still in its early stages and organizational systems were inconsistent. Some tribes cooperated with the emerging central authority, while others retained local independence. This fragmentation hindered coordinated military response. While the Philistines acted as a unified force with clear hierarchies, Israel relied on a patchwork of tribal contingents. This uneven structure explains why Israelite commanders often struggled to motivate their forces or enforce discipline. In the face of a well-orchestrated Philistine advance, Israel's disjointed organization faltered. Economics compounded these problems. Israel's highland environment, though fertile in pockets, lacked the expansive plains that supported large-scale grain production in Philistine territories. The limited surplus meant Israelite leaders had fewer resources to sustain long campaigns or equip specialized troops. The economic imbalance between the two societies manifested directly on the battlefield. A Philistine warrior clad in imported bronze or advanced iron represented the wealth and stability of his city-state. Israel's fighters, representing rural and scattered communities, embodied resilience, but not industrial capacity. Despite these challenges, Israel possessed strengths that would later shape its military evolution. Highland geography favored defensive tactics and guerrilla strategies. Israelite fighters excelled in ambushes, slinging techniques, and rapid maneuvers through rugged terrain. Their knowledge of valleys, ridges, and narrow passes compensated for their lack of heavy armor. This dynamic played a crucial role in later conflicts, as Israel gradually developed specialized units and adapted its tactics to counter Philistine supremacy. Yet, at the time of the Valley of Elah confrontation, these advantages were overshadowed by the overwhelming presence of Philistine infantry and champions. The influence of religion and cultural identity on combat psychology must also be considered. Israel's worldview interpreted military conflict not only through strategic concerns, but through the lens of divine favor and covenant identity. Confidence in battle often depended on a sense of spiritual alignment. When morale faltered, it was not merely fear of the enemy, but fear that the divine might not be with them. Facing a Philistine champion whose culture associated martial success with divine approval challenged Israel on multiple fronts, physically, emotionally, and theologically. Ancient texts reflect this dynamic, showing how the presence of a giant-like warrior tested the faith and resolve of Israel's army. The absence of professionalized Israelite soldiers also contributed to the crisis. Philistine champions like Goliath were likely trained from youth, conditioned physically, and equipped by state resources. Israel's strongest fighters, by contrast, emerged from rural life. They were shepherds, farmers, and craftsmen, not products of formal military academies. The skills they possessed, such as precision with a sling, were byproducts of daily life rather than structured training. While these skills could be devastatingly effective, their integration into formal battles required extraordinary circumstances and individual initiative. During the confrontation, Israel's soldiers witnessed a warrior whose very appearance represented a culmination of training, nutrition, culture, and industry. His armor alone would have been a rarity in Israelite experience. The scaled coat, the reinforced helmet, the massive spear shaft, these elements signaled a kind of military sophistication foreign to Israelite militias. Combined with his stature, the champion became a symbol of the disparity between the two nations. Philistine power was personified in a single man. Israel's weakness was revealed in their inability to produce a comparable fighter. Yet it is precisely within such imbalanced conditions that the dramatic tension of the narrative arises. The duel in the valley was not merely a clash of individuals, but a confrontation between systems. Urban militarism versus rural resilience, industrial power versus pastoral skill, dominance versus defiance. Israel's need for a champion was not a strategic choice, but a desperate response to overwhelming disadvantage. Their hesitation is understandable when viewed through archaeological, sociological, and military analysis. They faced an opponent who embodied everything they lacked. Into this landscape of fear and uncertainty, an unexpected figure would soon step forward, one whose background did not fit the patterns of professional warrior culture, yet whose skills were honed by a different kind of discipline. The stage, shaped by centuries of cultural development and years of escalating conflict, was set for a confrontation that neither side could have anticipated. To understand why a young shepherd from Bethlehem could step forward against a seasoned Philistine warrior, historians examine the role of shepherds in the ancient Near East. Far from being passive figures tending flocks in quiet fields, shepherds lived in dangerous environments and developed skills that were both practical and lethal. Their responsibilities demanded constant vigilance against predators, raiders, and rugged terrain. This daily exposure honed reflexes, sharpened awareness, and cultivated the ability to make split-second decisions. Such a life produced fighters who, though not soldiers in the formal sense, possessed a unique blend of agility, precision, and resilience. Archaeological discoveries across ancient pastoral regions confirm the central role of the sling in shepherd life. Stone projectiles found in Israel, Judah, and neighboring territories reveal standardized shapes and weights designed for maximum speed and impact. These stones, often made from limestone or basalt, could be hurled with extraordinary velocity. Ancient warfare texts from surrounding civilizations document slingers capable of striking targets at distances exceeding modern baseball pitching ranges. Shepherds, practicing daily to defend their flocks, naturally achieved levels of accuracy that formal armies struggled to reproduce. Their skill with the sling was not decorative. It was a survival necessity. A sling stone traveling at full force could penetrate armor, fracture skulls, or disable limbs. Reconstructions by modern researchers demonstrate that a skilled slinger could reach speeds comparable to those generated by professional athletes with modern equipment. The kinetic energy of such projectiles rivaled that of early handguns. This capacity makes the shepherd's weapon not merely adequate, but deadly, a tool capable of ending a duel in seconds. When ancient narratives describe a shepherd defeating a champion with a single stone, they align with the demonstrated physics of sling warfare rather than fantasy. Shepherds also possessed deep familiarity with terrain. Their daily routes took them through valleys, ridges, watercourses, and hidden paths. They studied the behavior of animals, the movement of shadows, and the subtle changes in wind patterns. This environmental literacy provided an advantage when navigating open battlefields or rugged landscapes. Shepherds learned to move quietly, to approach threats from angles, and to use natural cover instinctively. These skills translated into tactical insight uncommon among conventional infantry. When thrust into the valley of Elah, a shepherd would perceive its contours not as an unknown battlefield, but as a familiar type of terrain. Culturally, the image of the shepherd carried symbolic weight in Israelite society. Leaders, both political and spiritual, were often described metaphorically as shepherds guiding their people. This language reflects the high value placed on vigilance, courage, and sacrificial responsibility. The shepherd's role resonated deeply in a society shaped by pastoral traditions. When a shepherd stepped forward to defend Israel, he did so not only with physical skill, but with cultural legitimacy. His identity embodied qualities that his community respected: protection, responsibility, and willingness to confront danger. The economic realities of Israelite pastoral life also shaped the shepherd's character. These workers operated on the margins of settled communities, guarding livestock that represented a family's wealth and livelihood. Losses could be catastrophic. As a result, shepherds learned to act decisively when faced with threats. Historical accounts and regional traditions describe shepherds engaging predators with bare hands or improvised weapons, displaying bravery born not of training camps, but of daily necessity. Such courage made them capable of confronting foes larger than themselves when circumstances demanded. The tools of shepherd life reflect this blend of practicality and danger. The staff, both weapon and guide, served as a defense against animals and as a tool for maneuvering flocks. The sling, lightweight and easily carried, became the shepherd's most formidable asset. Some shepherds also carried small daggers or curved blades useful for both labor and combat. These implements were not ceremonial. They were functional, worn smooth by constant use. When ancient texts describe a shepherd carrying specific tools into a confrontation, they reflect the reality of a profession where every item had practical purpose rooted in survival. Social factors also influenced why a shepherd could step forward when trained soldiers hesitated. Israel's emerging monarchy had not yet established strong mechanisms for recognizing and promoting local talent from rural areas. Shepherds operated outside the urban centers where warriors were formally trained and equipped. Their confidence came from personal experience rather than institutional validation. In psychological terms, individuals outside rigid hierarchies are often more likely to volunteer for tasks considered unconventional or dangerous. They assess risk differently, relying on their own skills and judgment, rather than social expectations of soldierly behavior. The contrast between Philistine and Israelite warrior training highlights the shepherd's unique position. Philistine champions were shaped by a system that valued size, armor, and direct confrontation. Shepherds, by contrast, excelled in ranged attacks, asymmetric tactics, and hit-and-run strategies. In a conventional duel, the Philistine warrior held every advantage. But in a scenario where skill, speed, and precision could overturn expectations, a shepherd possessed attributes that heavy infantry did not. The shepherd's way of fighting did not match the champion's, and that mismatch became the source of his advantage. The theological dimension of shepherd identity further shaped Israelite perception. In their worldview, unexpected deliverance often came through unexpected agents. Shepherd figures in their traditions frequently emerged as protectors or leaders, their humble origins contrasting with acts of great courage. This cultural memory provided a framework for interpreting remarkable events. When a shepherd defended his people, his success reinforced an understanding that valor and purpose could arise from any part of society. Examining the shepherd's role through archaeology, anthropology, and textual history reveals a profession that produced individuals capable of extraordinary feats under the right circumstances. Their daily environment cultivated discipline, endurance, and accuracy. Their tools were simple but deadly. Their mindset was shaped by responsibility and survival. These qualities converged in the life of a young shepherd preparing to face a warrior whose entire identity had been forged in the structure of Philistine militarism. The duel that would soon unfold in the valley was not a meeting of equals in conventional terms. It was a collision of two distinct worlds, one shaped by discipline, hierarchy, and iron, the other shaped by terrain, instinct, and improvisation. The shepherd did not fit the expectations of a champion, yet he possessed the precise combination of skills necessary to challenge a formidably armored opponent. This convergence, unexpected, improbable, yet grounded in the lived realities of Iron Age pastoral life, sets the stage for the confrontation that would alter the memory of nations. The confrontation between the shepherd and the Philistine champion has echoed across centuries, not only because of the outcome, but because of what it represented to the ancient Near East. At its core, the duel distilled the tensions between two radically different societies, one defined by urban power, weaponized intimidation, and advanced metallurgy, the other defined by pastoral resilience, spiritual identity, and tactical ingenuity shaped by daily survival. To understand why this encounter became a turning point in collective memory, scholars examine how political, psychological, and cultural forces converged at this moment. The duel took place against the backdrop of rising Israelite identity. Israel was in the early stages of centralization, following generations marked by internal fragmentation and external threats. Their leaders sought symbols capable of unifying a population scattered across hills and valleys. A dramatic public confrontation, witnessed by soldiers, retold by families, and embedded in tradition, could serve as such a symbol. The psychological impact of overcoming a seemingly invincible opponent would strengthen national cohesion. In this sense, the duel transcended tactical significance. It became a narrative anchor for emerging identity. Philistine power, by contrast, was nearing a historical peak. Their cities boasted strong economies, advanced weapon-making, and influential trade networks. They projected authority throughout the region, often dictating terms to neighboring peoples. Their confidence was evident in their use of champions in ritualized single combat. Sending forth an elite warrior signaled their belief that no enemy could match their strength, a belief reinforced by decades of military advantage. The Philistine champion, with his towering stature and iron weaponry, embodied not only physical might, but cultural supremacy. When he issued his challenge, he represented an entire system that saw itself as dominant and unassailable. The very structure of the duel reinforced these themes. Single combat was more than a test of individual skill. It was a dramatic representation of collective identity. The defeat of a champion could demoralize an entire army, while his victory could justify territorial expansion. In ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern societies, this form of combat carried religious, political, and social weight. It was a public theater where gods, kings, and nations were symbolically invoked through the actions of individual fighters. When the shepherd and the warrior faced each other, they stepped into roles shaped not only by personal histories, but by the expectations of their entire cultures. The outcome of such a confrontation depended as much on perception as on physical strength. The Philistine champion's size and armor made him appear invincible, but his strengths came with limitations. Heavy armor reduced mobility, restricted peripheral vision, and required controlled terrain for maximum advantage. Shepherds, accustomed to moving rapidly across uneven landscapes, understood these limitations instinctively. Their fighting methods exploited distance, speed, and precision, qualities that heavy infantry often struggled to counter. By stepping into the valley armed with a sling rather than armor, the shepherd chose a strategy that neutralized the champion's greatest strengths. This tactical choice reflects a deeper theme: adaptation. Throughout their history, Israelite communities survived by adjusting to the resources available to them and developing unconventional approaches to threats. Their sparse industrial base forced them to rely on tools of daily life, transformed into weapons of necessity. Philistine warriors might have dismissed such tools as inferior, but their effectiveness, when wielded by individuals who had mastered them under harsh conditions, could be devastating. The shepherd's sling was not a symbol of weakness. It was an emblem of adaptive strength. The cultural memory of the duel also reflects broader anxieties of the ancient world. Many societies feared enemies who appeared larger, stronger, or better equipped. Tales of imposing adversaries appear across Mediterranean literature, often symbolizing external threats to cultural survival. The Philistine champion fits this archetype, a figure whose size and armor magnified fear. The shepherd, by contrast, fits the archetype of the unexpected protector, the humble figure whose courage redefines destiny. This narrative tension resonated deeply with Israelite traditions, which often emphasize the triumph of the overlooked or underestimated. The confrontation also marked a shift in regional dynamics. Philistine dominance, though formidable, was not unchallenged. Their reliance on urban centers made them vulnerable to disruptions in trade, shifts in political alliances, and emerging military innovations. Israel, though lacking formal infrastructure, was gaining in population, unity, and spiritual cohesion. The duel symbolized this transitional moment, the passing of an era dominated by coastal powers and the rise of a new political force in the highlands. Even before later conflicts cemented Israel's ascendancy, the memory of the duel pointed toward a future in which the balance of power would shift. From a sociological perspective, the duel illustrates how communities create meaning through conflict. By recounting the confrontation in detail, from the appearance of the champion to the actions of the shepherd, the narrative invited listeners to identify with resilience rather than fear. It offered a model of courage rooted not in physical might, but in strategic insight and moral conviction. This framing shaped how future generations interpreted their own challenges. The duel became a symbolic template for overcoming adversity through unconventional means. The geographical setting of the valley also contributed to the memory. Its openness allowed clear visibility, ensuring that every movement and gesture was witnessed by entire armies. The natural amphitheater etched the event into the minds of those present. When the shepherd advanced, his steps echoed across the plain. When the champion fell, the sight was unmistakable. The valley itself amplified the psychological weight of the moment, making it not merely a military incident, but a communal experience destined for retelling. As scholars analyze how this duel became a cultural turning point, they emphasize the interplay of historical conditions and symbolic resonance. The Philistines represented the larger, more technologically advanced power. Israel represented the smaller, less organized society fighting to define itself. The confrontation distilled this dynamic into a single, unforgettable moment. It captured imaginations precisely because it defied expectations, challenging assumptions about power, legitimacy, and destiny. The memory of the duel became a lens through which later generations understood their place in history. For Israel, it signified that courage and ingenuity could overturn seemingly unbreakable structures of dominance. For surrounding cultures observing from afar, it became a story of the unpredictable nature of conflict. And for scholars today, it stands as a testament to how historical events become woven into identity through narrative, ritual, and collective remembrance. The duel in the Valley of Elah thus marks more than a clash between two individuals. It represents a turning point in how a people understood themselves, their past, and their future. It was a moment when the balance of power, political, psychological, and cultural, began to shift. And although the broader struggle between the Philistines and Israel would continue for decades, this single confrontation became the symbol through which its meaning was remembered. In the years that followed the confrontation in the Valley of Elah, the balance of power in the southern Levant began to shift in ways that archaeology, ancient texts, and imperial records increasingly illuminate. The Philistine city-states, once dominant along the coastal plain, faced mounting pressures from expanding empires, internal vulnerabilities and shifting trade networks. Their decline was not sudden. It unfolded through a combination of geopolitical changes and structural weaknesses that gradually eroded the foundations of their power. Understanding this process requires tracing the trajectory of Philistine history from the height of their strength to the final dissolution of their independence. Assyrian records provide some of the clearest evidence of Philistine decline. As the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded westward in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, it encountered the Philistine Pentapolis, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, as a cluster of wealthy, fortified cities, controlling trade routes between Egypt and the Levant. The Assyrians, seeking to stabilize their frontier and extract tribute, launched campaigns that fundamentally altered local political structures. Stone reliefs and royal inscriptions describe sieges of Philistine cities, forced deportations of rebellious leaders, and the imposition of Assyrian-appointed governors. These events weakened the autonomy of the once powerful Philistine states, marking the beginning of irreversible decline. One of the most dramatic archaeological signatures of this period comes from the destruction of Gath, the city traditionally associated with Goliath. Excavations at the site reveal a massive destruction layer corresponding to an Assyrian campaign. The scale of the devastation indicates a powerful assault. Collapsed fortifications, charred debris, shattered ceramics, and arrowheads embedded in rubble. After this event, Gath diminished dramatically in political relevance. The city that once produced formidable champions lost its capacity to project power or influence regional affairs. Its fall symbolizes the shifting landscape that followed the rise of imperial control. Other Philistine cities fared no better. Ashdod endured repeated Assyrian interventions, culminating in prolonged sieges that reshaped its urban footprint. Ekron, once a major industrial center for olive oil production, evidenced by extensive oil presses discovered by archaeologists, was restructured under Assyrian rule into an administrative hub serving imperial interests. Ashkelon and Gaza, caught between Assyria and Egypt, oscillated between rebellion and submission, incurring both economic penalties and military reprisals. Over time, these pressures fragmented the Philistine political system and reduced the autonomy they had enjoyed during the early Iron Age. Economic changes also played a crucial role. Philistine prosperity had long depended on maritime trade, agricultural surpluses, and industrial production. Yet, as imperial powers took control of coastal routes, the economic advantages that once enriched Philistine cities shifted toward larger empires with more extensive networks. The commercialization of trade under Assyrian supervision meant that local elites faced new constraints. Tribute payments drained resources while Assyrian merchants and administrators integrated Philistine ports into broader imperial systems. The cities remained active, but their wealth no longer translated into independent power. Culturally, the Philistine identity began to transform. Early Philistine material culture, distinct pottery styles, Aegean-inspired architecture, and unique dietary patterns gradually blended with the broader Levantine environment. Over generations, the markers that had set Philistine society apart became less pronounced. Excavations show a progressive shift from the bold bichrome pottery of their early centuries toward more locally influenced styles. Their religious practices also appeared to incorporate regional elements. While this cultural blending shows adaptability, it also reflects dilution of the original Philistine identity. As external pressures increased, the coherence of their social and political structures diminished. Throughout this period, Israel and Judah experienced their own transformations. Israel's monarchy grew in strength and organization, benefiting from increased centralization and evolving military strategies. Though the kingdoms faced their own challenges, including later invasions by Assyria and Babylon, the early Israelite victories, such as the symbolic triumph in the Valley of Elah, had contributed to a growing sense of national identity. This identity survived long after the Philistines ceased to exist as an independent people. In contrast, Philistine identity, closely tied to their urban centers and coastal trade networks, proved more vulnerable to the shocks of empire. The Philistines continued to appear in ancient records even after their political autonomy declined. Assyrian and Babylonian lists mention them as tributaries. Egyptian sources refer to them in trade connections. Yet, their role diminished over time, shifting from regional powerhouses to marginal actors at the edge of empire. By the time the Babylonians expanded into the region, the Philistine cities had been weakened by centuries of political realignment. Babylonian campaigns further disrupted local life, and new populations moved into formerly Philistine territories. Archaeological layers from this period show changes in pottery, architecture, and urban planning consistent with population turnover and cultural assimilation. By the early Persian period, the distinct Philistine identity had largely disappeared. Their cities remained inhabited, but the people who lived there were part of new political and cultural configurations. The memory of the Philistines endured in texts, as formidable enemies, as symbols of ancient conflict, as archetypes of imposing adversaries. But their real-world presence had dissolved into the broader fabric of Levantine society. Their disappearance was not a singular event, but a gradual fading. As generations passed and older traditions gave way to new ones shaped by empire. The decline of the Philistines illuminates broader patterns in ancient history. Societies built around urban strength, coastal trade, and technological advantage can flourish rapidly. But they may also face sudden vulnerability when confronted by larger imperial systems. The Philistines were not defeated solely by military force. They were absorbed into a world that was changing around them. Their story demonstrates how cultural identity can flourish under favorable conditions, yet dissolve when external pressures reshape the environments that sustain it. Against this backdrop, the memory of the duel between the shepherd and the champion gains symbolic power. It represents more than an isolated victory. It becomes the opening movement in a larger historical trajectory in which the once dominant Philistines lose ground to rising forces. The shepherd's triumph foreshadows a future in which Israel's narrative would continue, while Philistine identity would eventually recede. The duel becomes a hinge between eras, a moment that captures the transition from one historical reality to another. For later generations, the memory of Philistine decline carried lessons about the fragility of power built on military advantage, economic strength, or cultural prestige. The Philistines were formidable, wealthy, and influential, until they were not. Their disappearance underscores how civilizations can be reshaped by forces beyond their control. Shifting trade patterns, imperial ambitions, and evolving cultural landscapes. In this sense, The duel in the valley of Elah gains retrospective significance as a symbol of a world in flux. By tracing the arc of Philistine history from dominance to decline, scholars reveal how a single dramatic confrontation became a story that endured while an entire culture gradually vanished. The memory of Goliath survived. The society that produced him did not. This contrast highlights the power of narrative to preserve fragments of lost civilizations, offering a window into worlds otherwise erased by time. The legacy of Goliath endures not because archaeology has uncovered his bones or because historians can reconstruct his precise height, but because his story occupies a unique intersection between history, anthropology, and human memory. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, ancient cultures preserved accounts of unusually tall warriors, elite fighters whose formidable presence shaped the psychological landscape of battle. These traditions, once viewed as mythic exaggerations, are increasingly understood as reflections of real demographic patterns, cultural values, and military practices. Within this broader context, Goliath stands as the most iconic representative of a phenomenon that transcended any single individual. Anthropologists studying skeletal remains across the Aegean, Anatolia, and Cypriot regions frequently identify individuals taller than the populations of inland Levantine settlements. These findings align with environmental and nutritional factors that favored height. Maritime diets rich in protein, diverse genetic backgrounds due to seafaring mobility, and aristocratic upbringings that provided consistent access to food. While these traits did not produce giants in the fantastical sense, they did produce elite warriors whose stature could genuinely intimidate shorter highland populations. Goliath, as remembered in ancient texts, fits squarely within this pattern, an imposing fighter whose physical attributes were extraordinary, yet historically plausible. Archaeology adds further dimension to this portrait. Iron Age burial sites associated with warrior elites often contain grave goods that signal both status and physical capability. Long swords, oversized spearheads, and armor fragments tailored for broad torsos and tall frames. Some skeletons reveal stress markers consistent with intense physical training, reinforcing the idea that elite fighters were shaped by demanding routines from a young age. Although no grave has been definitively identified as Philistine in origin, with a skeleton reaching legendary proportions, the broader evidence demonstrates that warriors of exceptional height were neither unheard of nor unimaginable in the ancient Mediterranean world. Textual analysis supports this anthropological framework. Descriptions of imposing warriors appear not just in Israelite traditions, but in Egyptian, Hittite, and early Greek literature. These depictions share common features: intimidating height, specialized weaponry, and central roles in battle narratives. Such stories were not inventions of fantasy, but reflections of cultural encounters with formidable fighters whose presence left deep impressions. When Israelite scribes included the memory of a towering Philistine warrior, they were participating in a wider, ancient literary practice grounded in real historical experiences. The story of Goliath also illustrates how collective memory functions in ancient cultures. Narratives involving extraordinary individuals become symbolic reservoirs through which communities interpret their struggles, victories, and aspirations. The memory of the champion in the Valley of Elah captured the tension between a militarized coastal power and a rising highland society. By framing the confrontation as a duel between an overwhelmingly strong adversary and an unexpected defender, The story expressed themes of vulnerability, courage, and identity that resonated across generations. Even as the Philistines faded from history, the symbolic weight of their champion endured. Over centuries, scribes and teachers retold the account with variations shaped by context. Some traditions emphasized Goliath's size, accentuating his role as the embodiment of Philistine strength. Others focused on the details of his armor, presenting him as the ultimate product of Iron Age military technology. Still others highlighted the unlikely background of his opponent, underscoring themes of humility and ingenuity. These variations reveal how the narrative adapted to the needs of each generation while preserving its core elements: an overwhelming threat, an unexpected defender, and a victory that defied conventional expectations. Scholars studying ancient Israel's development have long noted that national identity often crystallizes around iconic narratives. The confrontation in the Valley of Elah became more than a historical episode. It became a touchstone for understanding the relationship between power and vulnerability. The young defender, armed not with heavy armor, but with skill honed in pastoral life, represented the potential for triumph through strategy rather than brute force. This theme resonated deeply within a society that often faced formidable external threats. Through centuries of change, invasions, exiles, returns, the memory of this confrontation offered a paradigm for interpreting adversity. Despite its symbolic layers, the narrative remains grounded in the realities of ancient Near Eastern life. The Philistine champion was not a fantasy creature, but a member of a warrior elite shaped by cultural and environmental factors. His strength reflected the economic and technological advantage of his people. The shepherd's victory reflected the adaptive resilience of rural communities confronting superior forces. Far from being a supernatural tale, the confrontation embodies the dynamics of asymmetric conflict that appear repeatedly throughout history. Its enduring power lies in its realism, not its embellishment. Modern scholarship continues to refine our understanding of this iconic event. Advances in archaeology have revealed more about Philistine industry, dietary patterns, and martial culture. Studies of ancient manuscripts illuminate how different textual traditions preserved complementary or divergent details. Anthropological research contextualizes ancient perceptions of height and physical intimidation. Together, these disciplines produce a fuller, richer picture of the world that gave rise to Goliath and the duel that defined him. Through these lenses, the champion becomes a figure who bridges the gap between historical reality and cultural memory. He embodies both the specific conditions of Iron Age Philistia and the broader human fascination with extraordinary individuals who represent collective power. His story illustrates how ancient societies understood strength, how they commemorated conflict, and how they transmitted identity across generations. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of Goliath's legacy is what it reveals about the people who remembered him. The narrative does not glorify overwhelming power. Rather, it preserves the moment when such power was overcome through skill, insight, and determination. It is a testament to the human tendency to valorize ingenuity over intimidation, to celebrate unexpected triumphs, and to find meaning in the fragile balance between strength and vulnerability. In this way, the story of Goliath transcends its time and culture. It remains relevant, not because it describes a mythical giant, but because it captures a universal pattern. the encounter between the formidable and the underestimated, the powerful and the resilient. Archaeology and textual scholarship deepen this insight, showing that behind the legend stood real people shaped by real histories. The Philistines, with all their might, have long since vanished from the world stage. But the memory of the champion they produced and the shepherd who confronted him continues to illuminate the ancient world and the enduring narratives through which humanity understands itself.